starting to do work. Data modeling is the idea of taking an idea and turning it into a database. Jack and I came from this style of development that's, I think, correctly called agile, and it's very popular. But when you want to build something, you write these things called stories. And right now what we're looking at is a set of stories that we wrote for an actual app that we built called PGCast. So PGCast is let's see, pgcast.com. It's a website on the internet, pgcast.com. We made it together at HashRocket. It's a series of screencasts, so about Postgres. And because Postgres is pretty timeless, they're all still pretty relevant, I would say. So here on the main page, you have like a featured screencast, and then down below, these are all the different screencasts that we made. So it's got like a title and an author and a tag, and then we included the transcript so people could copy and paste to their heart's content, and like all the setup and stuff. So this was a project that we made when we were had some time on our hands back at HashRocket, and the way we built it was writing these stories. So this was like a 2 to 3 day long session with 2 developers, a product manager, a designer, and like the stakeholder, and maybe a few other people, where you sit down and you say, okay, we want this website that shows videos. What does that actually mean in fine detail? So this is a typical story that would come out of that. And this is when you're starting a project, maybe for work. This is something someone might give you. It's a feature. We wrote a name, visitor views, most recent cast. And then we have this description, and this is written in the syntax called Gherkin. It was famously utilized by a Ruby testing framework called Cucumber, but it's very common in Agile. It's called given, when, then. So given something, in this case, given I'm a visitor, and then when I do something, then something happens. And is thrown in there as a way to like append information to any of these steps. So we have this list of stories, and our job is then to turn it into software. It's just similar. It's a position you'll be in your projects, and add there every day with a story like this. So we don't usually sit down and build a data model at the beginning in my style of development. The reason behind that is that it's like that Sandy Metz quote I started the day off, right? You want to delay making decisions as long as you can. I don't want to like commit to a database design until I have to, because this is the whole kind of underlying agile concept. I want to be able to stop at any point and have a working thing. So if I get down to this story and then the client decides not to pay us anymore, I've built something that works, and I didn't create a database that has all kinds of tables that don't have any use, that never get shown to the user. So I don't want to, generally speaking, I don't personally want to sit and like draw out a database from scratch, but sometimes it's very, very valuable exercise. I've done it with Jack a few times on really challenging projects with complex databases. And the exercise we're going to do for the next 40 minutes is, it's not what I would typically do at the beginning of a project, but I might, it kind of mirrors what I would be building as I built these tickets. So we're going to skip all the front end. We're going to skip all the making it look good and all the interactions and network requests and everything like that. We're just going to like build what the database would be at each step. So what I've done is I've taken these stories and I've put them into this whimsical whiteboard, and we're going to talk through them, and I'll ask some questions, and we'll see if we can figure out what this database would look like. Okay, so here's the first one. Story type feature. That's like a bucket for all the stories, basically. Visitor views most recent cast. So the thing that the designers and the stakeholder were imagining here is this thing. When you get to the page, there's a big screencast here with some like basic information. Okay, so visitor views most recent cast. And if you look in the repository, the method I'm applying here is called an entity relationship approach, where we're going to like think about the tables and think about what the tables do and think about how they're related to each other. So given I'm a visitor, okay, for just that sentence, do we have a table? Is there a table in the database yet? There's no wrong answer here, but any answer will suffice to start with.
Like, I would say only if there's like a login, right? If you're not going to keep track of the visitor by different values, then visitor itself wouldn't, but maybe one for visitor versus employee.
Yep. A lot of great points. Like everything in software is a trade-off. You'll hear that a million times, but it's very true. There's a concept I want to introduce. If I'm the first person to share it, then I'm proud. It's called YAGNI. You aren't going to need it. This is a thing that software developers like to pull out like a, like a samurai sword or something. But it's true a lot. You don't want to build something prematurely. It's better to wait, like Sandy Metz said. So in the sake of waiting, I'm going to agree with what you said first, Alicia, that there's no table because you're just a visitor. We don't even know what that means. There's might not even be a database. We know we'll probably need a database, but we don't have to make one to get through this line. When I land on the PGCast site, pgcast.com, right? You don't need a database to have a website. You can have it be a static HTML website with no database. So I think you can definitely get through the second sentence for that database. Third, then I am presented with the most recent screencast. Okay, so first of all, we have something called a cast. That was our terminology for the screencast. So we need to, we kind of know that we're going to be in a world of data here. This is going to persist, and that we don't want to like be just writing pure static HTML and CSS. So what would be a table name that we could use here for this item, the screencast?
Casts.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's okay. Could also do like screencast or like video or something. We couldn't really make up our minds on this, but cast is good, I think. Okay, so cast. Let's go with cast. And for the cast, I see an image, a title, an author, and a description. Okay, so let's take each one of those in turn. An image. We need some way to store images right now. How could we add to this table so that it could handle images?
Create a column for images.
Okay. Sure, images. I like that. What would you call it? Image?
Maybe image or screenshot or something like that.
Okay. And so just for context, that was like, we had this idea that we were gonna have a screenshot here.
Or maybe thumbnail.
Okay, thumbnail, sure. Okay, what's the type of that? Is it
Type is in like file type, like PNG or a JPEG.
no, as in like the Postgres data type of the data, right? We can have
Varchar.
text. Okay, varchar. That's a fine answer. How would varchar be supporting this goal?
Just be the name of the image, or maybe the file name.
Okay, sure. And that's a file like on the server somewhere. Is that the idea? So varchar, it's a file name. Is that what you're thinking? Like it points to a file somewhere on the server.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. That could definitely work. One way that this gets handled a lot is like, instead of thumbnail, this is like thumbnail URL. And then instead of this being a location of a file or a file itself, it's pointing to like an Amazon S3 resource or like a CDN. But you can definitely store it on the server too. That's going to be a little bit of a performance hit sometimes, but it's simple. Okay, is this allowed to be null?
I'm gonna say yes. I mean,
Okay.
sometimes you just don't have a picture.
Yeah. Okay, so that would be like a feature you're almost giving to the administrators, that they get the choice whether they want to add a screenshot or not. Totally legitimate answer. What that leads to is that either in your database code, but more likely in your application code, you're going to be coming up with some kind of backup, right? So like if there's no thumbnail, then you're going to show maybe just like the PGCast logo or something. So I think that that's a totally fine choice. I sometimes lean towards just making things not null and saying like, you have to enter this, because then I don't have to write code to handle those exceptions. But I think you could actually make it null if you wanted. Does that trade-off make sense? If you say it can be null, it's going to be null on some records, and then you have to handle that, because if you just put in an image tag with a source attribute and it's an empty string or a null, then this won't work. And so you have to account for that somewhere if you give that ability to the people who maintain the site. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so varchar null true. Okay, so I think we've gotten through this column pretty well. One thing that I'm leaving off is that you always have like these timestamp fields that say when it was created or updated. We won't be including that, but you'd see that on the table. I'm sorry, for the whole table, not for this column. Okay, title. That's this window functions. What's the data type?
Varchar.
Okay, can that be null?
No.
No.
I don't think so. We don't want every field to be nullable. Like what is a screencast that doesn't have a title? It's like a book that doesn't have a title, right? I think that's a pretty reasonable request. I see a hand up.
Yeah, sorry if I just lost this somewhere. I'm just kind of confused. Like, where are you specifically writing this? Like, what is this called? Wherever you're putting this.
Like what is this website, or what is?
Like, is this just part of the website functionality? Like, I'm just trying to figure out how we would use this if it wasn't this workshop. And I guess I don't really understand what you're like writing this in.
Okay, so what I'm doing right now, imagine that I'm just writing on a whiteboard. It's a digital whiteboard because the whiteboard behind me is sort of hard to see. But the way that you'd actually implement this is you would draw a whole picture of like all of the database, and then that's when you'd get to that migration that I was looking at. Okay, this is a different one, but when we finish, and this is written in Elixir for reasons. When you finish with this diagram, what you could do is you could say create table casts, right? And create casts, and then you could say image URL. Sorry, add image URL varchar. No, false. And then when you create your database to start building this project, you'd run all these scripts and you would get this database shape.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's helpful sometimes to like map it out away from the computer, though, I find.
Right, like Jake said, if we were actually doing this in person, like we wouldn't be using a website at all. We would be like on a whiteboard.
Yeah, I did it on this whiteboard last time and it worked out okay, but I think it's better on the whimsical. Okay, so we have a title. It's varchar. It's not null. Next, author. Okay, how do we represent an author?
Varchar.
Sure. And maybe we'll say that's not null either. Now, practically, when you're doing this, your author is going to end up being something like this, and each cast is going to have a string like that. You know, oh, I think I typed that right. Is there a trade-off to that?
As far as accessing the first and last name individually.
That's not a bad direction to go. Right, if you want to, let's say I just want to show the first name, well, I have to write Python code or the right. Actually, no, that wouldn't work. You'd have to do a string split or something. I'd have to write some code that splits these. No, I'm more interested in what's the trade-off of storing this thing as a string at all.
And it couldn't have its own table.
It could, and that's, I think, that's what I was thinking of, right? Like when you store a string, it's pretty easy to do this. You know, there's not a lot stopping. There's really not like a lot of there's not a lot stopping this from happening. I mean, you could write some like code that checks that it's in a list of an array of values or something, but it's really easy to do this because if you just imagine someone's filling out a form to enter this screencast and you're saying, who is the author? Well, you know, just on any random day, whoever's doing this, they might think my name is Jacob or something, and they might, you're giving that person, you're giving that administrator like a lot of ability to mess it up, and there's no interconnectedness between these two strings, right? They're just two strings. I think that this is a pretty good solution right now with what we know, but the alternative would be to make a table that's like authors, and that's actually usually the first thing that people suggest when we go through this exercise. So I appreciate the string solution, but does that trade-off make sense? I don't know if I perhaps I didn't explain this greatly, but if you have an authors table and you have a name field, then there's only one Jake Worth out there. And then you're saying, you know, author ID equals that record. And then when you show the name, it's always going to be this value rather than like whatever random string you put in there. Does that make sense?
What would happen if there was two Jake Worths? Wouldn't it kind of mess that up?
Well, that's how you'd enforce that, is you'd say, you'd add a unique constraint, which we didn't really get to constraints much. But constraints are a important part of databases. You add a unique constraint on name, which says that there can't ever be the same name twice.
So I think he was saying is like, what if there's two John Smiths, but they are in fact two different people? So probably the unique key on authors, right?
Sure, yeah. Definitely.
Or is this better to think about this as a username as opposed to a real name, or like, or does that not make sense? Because I guess it makes sense how you said it and how Alicia says it, but I guess it just matters on like what your website's doing, maybe.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't put a unique constraint on the name. There was sort of like a throwaway example. But by making it relational, you're allowing there to be two Jake Worths, right? Let's say that you have two employees named Jake Worth. Seems unlikely, but maybe that happens somehow. I can say this cast author is author number one, and that's Jake Worth, who you know, maybe to help me tell them apart, I given a department field. And then the next author is you know, Jake Worth, and who works in HR. So I would use this field internally just for me to tell the two people apart, but they each have a unique ID. And so when I'm saying this cast has an ID of 3, I know which Jake it is.
Yep, makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. So you don't get any of that with strings. With strings, you just get, you know, it's a string, and that's not a bad solution. Again, it's just it's two different ways of going. And since we're going down this sort of agile road, I think we're gonna stick with that for now. We're gonna say it's a string, it's a varchar, can't be null. That certainly right now, if you look at this, it's just a you know, maybe it's just a name and there's no link here. They didn't say anything about a link, so the agile approach maybe would be to just have it be a string. Okay, we have one more field on this table, description. Data type.
Oh, that's got to be text.
Yes. I mean, Jack, can you fill us in on the? I can't never remember this, like the difference between those two. I think they're practically pretty similar.
Yeah, in Postgres, varchar and text are almost exactly the same. So you can pretty much use them interchangeably. Convention is that varchar is like for single lines and text is for like larger bits of text. But again, technically you can use either one and it won't make a difference in Postgres.
That's great. I actually think that text is a better choice in that case because it's like communicating what it's for. Even though it behaves exactly the same, I feel like when you put that text label on there, you're telling other programmers, you know, this is going to be maybe multiple paragraphs instead of one string. Conversely, if all it ever was one sentence, maybe varchar would be better. Okay, so we've gotten through the first story, we have a table, and then to take this into the real world, we could write a migration that makes this table, and then we could build all of this out in HTML and CSS and all the other things that go with it to deliver this one story. We're gonna keep going though. Okay, next we have visitor views a list. Oh, I think I left something off. I forgot this most recent. What does that mean? What is the most recent cast?
It's the one that was made most recently, I guess.
That is a great start to the conversation. What does it mean to be made most recently?
The last class that was added to the database.
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty good start. So I mentioned we left something off here, which is in Rails land you have a created at and an updated at, and these are timestamps with TZ. There's a little bit of a funny thing with these though, is that we don't really ever we let the framework manage these. So Django ORM, Active Record, we let them deal with these. They change them, and Postgres changes them. I guess Postgres doesn't really change them. You could make them change them. We let the ORM handle these, and they update them when they update them. In Rails, when you call update on a record, it behind the scenes it updates this. So we never change these by hand, and we kind of rely on them being computer generated timestamps, not human altered timestamps. So would we want to use which of these or none of them would we want to use to try to determine which is the most recent?
Created at.
No, created.
Yeah, this is the trade-off, right? Updated at, well, I go in and I change the author on the cast. Suddenly that is now at the top of this. I wouldn't expect that to happen. If I was a programmer, I'd be surprised by that. But you could. Created at. So let's just say, okay, we don't want to use updated at for a second. What about created at?
That should be the very latest one that was made, right?
Yeah. I'll
Unless you
give an
delete something and-
example of when this might not work. A new application, you're shipping to production for the first time, and you're doing something called seeding the database, which is like putting a bunch of records in it to start it off. And you're seeding it with the first 10 screencasts. You've taken the time to record 10 screencasts, and you're seeding them. That means that you run a script, and those 10 records get created, as fast as the computer can do it. That created that value for those records is correct. They were all created within a second of each other. In that case, you don't really have a meaningful created at. And since I suggested we don't alter those timestamps, or try to set them up to be anything other than what they are, you've lost the ability to rely on that. And that happens. That, like, if you look at a new application, excuse me, if you look at an application that's been around for a little while, you can look at like some records that are around for a long time, like their products table or something, and you can see, hey, 4 of them were made within a second of each other 2 years ago because we added these products, and so that's a limitation of created at. We think of it as like, well, I was just using the app and I put in a record, and then a month later I put in another record, but that doesn't happen when a computer puts them in there.
So maybe instead of using those, use them, create another field for the order that you want them to show up at.
You could, yep. You could have like an order field. I think a way that you might solve this is to, yeah, so that would look like what, like an order number, I guess, false. Then you're kind of hand managing it though, right? The newest record comes out and you're like, okay, now you're number 1, or now I guess each one could get a different order, and then it would be ordered 1 to highest. One way that you could handle this that a lot of websites do is they'll have a field like published at. And this is not a magical timestamp. It's just a regular timestamp that you're allowed to alter and change. And so then you could say I want this to be I want the first one to be a year ago. I mean, there's no rule against that. And I want the one I'm publishing today to be today. And then you could order it by this field. And you're not altering these computer maintained fields. So that's another approach. You could also do something kind of cool, which is you could do null true. We did this on TIL, which is a site that I saw. Yeah, we talked about earlier today. We allowed publish that to be null true. So what does it mean if publish that is null?
It hasn't been published.
Yeah, Jack kind of set me up to make that question sound stupid, because null is, we don't know what null is, and maybe that's a bad way to do it. But this is something people will do, where they'll say if it's null, then it hasn't been published. And that's like a way you can separate things that are live and customer facing from like drafts or things that you unpublished. It's a technique. But if we were to go this route and we were to say you have this publish that field, now you can use a Python or a SQL to say, cast latest, and then that's like under the scene, behind the scenes, that's like, ordering on that field. So that would give us the most recent. Okay, now we're through the first story. Okay, next up, visitor views a list of recent casts. Given my visitor viewing the homepage for PGCast, when there are recent casts, I'm not sure what that means, but we'll figure it out. Then I see up to n number of recent casts, and they're sorted in descending order by date. Okay, we just built that. This will support that. And then for each video, I see cast, image, title, and author. So everything we built would get us through the second story. Next, visitor views a show page for a cast. So in web dev, we would call this an index. Probably, you guys may have covered this already. And we would call the individual page where a resource is visible the show page. Index, show page. Given I'm a visitor viewing the landing page for a cast, okay, that's like the home screen. When I click on the cast, then I am taken to the show page for that cast. That's an interesting detail. So maybe let's take a look at this since we have a working implementation. When I clicked on this, what does the URL change to? Can anyone see?
Title of the cast.
Yeah, this one did. Window functions, window dash functions. Let's see if they all do that. Looks, this one did the same thing. Geolocations using PostGIS. This looks exactly the same. Does anyone know why you might do this? Why you might do this versus something like this? because that's what Django and Rails and that's what they set you up to do when you start, is when you do a show page, it's the ID, it's the primary key. Why might you go this route?
You don't want the user to see how your database is structured.
Yeah, awesome, exactly. Right, my talk this morning, we don't want the user to know how the database is organized, right? When I see this and it's kind of like leaking the database a little bit. I mean, you see it a lot, so it's not like, it's not like the worst thing in the world, but when you see this, I can basically tell you that you have made 3 episodes at least, and that you're using a number as your primary key instead of like a UUID. And when I see 303 as the first screencast, I can tell that you had 302 other episodes that you deleted for some reason. It just tells me like, and also I can be like, oh, what if I want to see an episode that isn't live yet? I'll try an ID that's above this. It lets the customer like know some stuff about the database that maybe they don't need to know. Another cool thing with a URL like this is that it's readable, right? It's like, it's words, it's the same words in the title. It's great. They say it's good for SEO to have like a readable title. I think there's just some real pros to doing it that way. So let's say that was baked into the story that we're going to do that. Maybe I'll just write it in like it was there all along. When I click on a cast, then I see the show page for that cast, and I see the title of the cast in the URL. Do we need to change the database at all to make that happen?
You already have the title, so I don't think you should.
Yeah, the simple implementation is no. You can just take the title and turn it into what we would call a slug. A slightly nicer thing for your dev team would be to store that separately. Varchar null false, or an alternative way. I don't know if it's nicer, but can anyone think of why you might want to consider storing it separately?
So you don't have to translate the title and take out the spaces and put an underscore or a dash.
I like that, but that's pretty easy, at least in Ruby, title to slug, title G sub spaces with dashes, right? You can write that code pretty quick.
I don't know exactly how it all ties together, but I'm thinking possibly like then you'd have a separate entity with its own URL. So sending any sort of requests or anything through like Django or something would be a lot easier than trying to route the data. I don't know. That's just a harebrained idea there.
It's not. We're kind of staying in the realm, I think, of like the application code and not thinking too much about like routing and external the application. So like in your Django routes file, I'm going to learn some Django someday so that I can use the right terminology when teaching this class. But in your Django routes file, if it's anything like Rails, you'd have a route that's like episodes. That's not how you spell that. And then it would be like slug. And then in your controller, you would match against that. So it just sends this to the controller as a field called slug, and then it's your job to implement this like slug method. so the Python code to do this isn't very complicated in my mind. What is complicated is that if you go down the road of turning the title into the slug, you can't, once the screencast is live, you really can't ever change the title because that changes the URL. So you take this URL and you post it on Twitter or something, and when it's derived from the title, you're kind of like basically permanently locked into this title. And you might not want to do that, right? Like news sites change their titles like all the time, but the original article URL that they shared lasts forever. I mean, you could solve this with redirects, I guess, but maybe this is a pretty good slug, but then you decide that you want to change the title and you don't mind that they don't match. This is getting quite hypothetical, but I hope that's maybe shed some light on a reason you might consider doing like a separate slug. We'll derive it from title for now. Okay, for the cast, I see a video player. All right, so we need video. How could we show a video for the screencast?
A URL tag?
Sure, like another column on the table.
Yeah.
Video URL. Varchar null false. Okay, so then we're uploading it somewhere else and we're not worrying about maintaining it ourselves. I like that. Title, author, description, tag list. Tag list. Okay, this is our last challenge. We had this idea of tags, and we thought we're going to tag these screencasts, and then everyone will know what Postgres version we were on, and won't that be great? So let's say we know right off we're using Postgres 11 for everything, and we want to have maybe one other tag. We want a Postgres 11 tag, and we want a like PG admin tag. How could we represent that in the database?
You could create a different table.
Yeah, that's what I would probably do. What would we call the table?
Tag name or tag.
Yeah, okay. And all we know we need right now is a name. The design just shows the name. So what do we need to add to this table in order to have that?
ID and a name.
Sure. Yes, ID is like a hidden field on all of these. I should have mentioned that. Name, a string maybe. Also not, I would say this is not, cannot be null. What good is a tag that doesn't have a name? That's the only thing it does is show its name. The alternative is if you wanted to, if let's say you only had one tag that you're ever going to, you're just going to do one tag per post, you could have like a tag varchar null false. Or if you know I want multiple tags, you could have tags, and this could be an array. Maybe these are both true. And this is like every trade-off we've discussed, I think that this is like pretty good, but maybe you look ahead and you see, I want to click on the tag and I want to see all the screencasts that are tagged with that tag. Well, this doesn't work anymore really, because this is just a string and it doesn't have any, you can't say, hey tag, give me all your screencasts, because it's just a string. But if you went down this road in the first place, then you can do that. So I think relationally, this is like probably the right call, even from the start.
So if we wanted to be able to click on a tag and view all the other videos that are tagged with that, would we need to add another column in our cast table with like a tag ID that references the tag table?
Yeah, this is when this arrow is drawn, it's like a shorthand for tag, like a column like tag ID. Or I guess we want maybe multiple tags. So you could, how would you represent that? It's like the words for it would be like a cast has many tags. It's like a has and belongs to many relationship. Because you want it to go both ways, right? A tag can have a bunch of casts, but a cast can have a bunch of tags. So we call that a have and belong to many relationship. And I think you would need a join table to accomplish that, which we didn't get to today. But you basically have a table in between these two called cast tags. And it has a cast ID and a tag ID, and it lets you connect the two together multiple times. I think we're coming up on time. Jack, did you have anything you wanted to add to the exercise?
Yeah, so somebody just messaged me and was observing the fact that do we really even need a database here? I thought that was very insightful. Jake, you want to tell us how we actually did this originally?
I love that question. Yes. So the original website for PGCast was a middleman app. Middleman is a server rendered markdown to HTML application. So you write markdown files and then you say build and it turns them into HTML, and that's what you deploy. So there actually wasn't a database originally for this app. As it grew, we decided we wanted to do more, and we wanted to have more of this relational power that we didn't have. So we converted it. Actually, one of our team members, really like alone, converted it to a Ruby on Rails app with a Postgres database. So it's possible to do a lot of things on the web without a database. You know, no reason to deny that. Something like this is a great example of an app where you could probably get away with not having a database, right? This is a markdown file, and it has the transcript is like the body of the markdown file, and then you use a block of information at the top called front matter that builds the rest of this. So it has like a title and an author name and a description and a tags list, which is like just a markdown list. And then that turns, that becomes this. And that's like a really good solution for something like this, where you're just showing information. I would probably go that route over a database because it's just a lot simpler. But eventually, the developer who did that change, who was working on the site a lot, she wanted to be able to do things like have sites go live at a certain time. And with server, not server rendered, static with a static generator like Middleman, it whatever the state it was in when you built it, that's what's going to production. So it doesn't, it generally doesn't like change. You have to build it again and deploy it. Good question. It is ironic.
Yeah. Yeah. So that actually kind of lets this be an example of a bunch of things. So that whole agile idea of don't build what you don't need. When we first built this, it was like, I guess we don't actually even need a database. And we went that way for a while. And when it became needed, then it was added. But this site actually was an example of that, do as little as you possibly can until you absolutely need it.
Yes, thank you. Okay, we usually wrap up with a Q&A session. We could take a break before doing that, or we could just roll right into it. Does anyone have a preference on that? I try to do a break every hour, but we could just okay. Let's take 5 and then we'll do our Q&A. So we'll meet up at 6 after.
It's the requirements change. So, I mean, I find stuff all the time that I'm working on a project and it's like, man, this is annoying. It's not right anymore. But it's because we changed direction and now we carried a bunch of technology, 100 yards that way. Now we realize we need to go that way. We need to carry it all back. So it's not necessarily that, debt. It's like changing direction when you're driving a bus.
Yeah, as much as we try to predict where technology is going, like we're wrong as much as we're right. And there's rewrites are just a part of, like if you go to a software team that's been around for 8 years, they've probably rewritten the whole like core application at least one time. Unless it's a really small, it's just inevitable. So you try to avoid that by making the best choice you can. And sometimes we like, if it's a scale issue or something, it's like almost like that's a great problem to have, right? Like this application survived for 5 years and people are using it, and now we want more features that we don't have. It's like I wouldn't want to be doing a rewrite, but it's like pretty cool that you're even there when most software products don't ever get there.
Right. And one thing that's kind of in particular about that data modeling exercise we did with Today I Learned, or no, that was PGCast. Today I Learned was the other one. So with PGCast, an interesting thing with that is the data modeling we did actually is still entirely relevant, even if we don't use Postgres. The Middleman app had a data model. That idea of there are posts or there are casts, and each cast has a title and each cast has a video link, and all of that data model still existed. It was just encoded in the static files, the YAML files, that and Markdown. And you'll find that data modeling, that is useful in any programming setup, whether SQL or Python or whatever. When you're working, you need to model like what are the entities in this world that I'm trying to build. Whether or not you're persisting it to a database or what kind of database, you're always doing that. So since we have a few seconds without a question, I'll just throw in a little bit of cheerleading for SQL. We talked about how this is such an old language, like its roots go back to the 70s. Well, it's not just an old language, it also doesn't change too fast. So if you found a SQL textbook from 20 years ago, and you found it like at a used bookshop or something, go ahead and get it, because 95% of it is still going to be totally relevant today. And how many languages are like that? I mean, even when Jake and I first started teaching this, like the hot thing was Ruby. 10 years ago, if like, well, what language should you learn first? Well, you should learn Ruby. Well, not too many people say that anymore. Maybe it's JavaScript, maybe it's Python, maybe it's Go. but not too many people say Ruby. But as far as something that you would have learned that is still going to be really valuable to your career, if you learned SQL well 20 years ago, that's still valuable today. And it's very likely to still be valuable 20 years from now.
Is there going to be another workshop day for you guys, or is this just it?
We do it once a platoon, so this is it for this cohort.
All right.
But I'm in Code Platoon Slack. So is Jack, and I will always be available for questions and stuff. I'm usually mentoring a student in a cohort. I decided not to this summer just to have some time back, but always available for Q&A and chatting. I see a question, Nathan.
Yes, hi. I actually was curious a little bit about Ruby and just kind of your experiences with it. Something I've kind of been interested in. I don't know much about it. This is the first time I've seen it used. So just like, do you still find it really useful with SQL? Speak a little bit about it.
Jake,
Yeah,
are you still working with it? I still have a couple projects in Ruby.
Yeah, my day job, the API is Ruby on Rails, and you, are you still using it for work?
Yeah, I still have a couple Rails projects that I work. I mean, my personal opinion of it, I mean, Ruby is great. The industry mindset seems to have moved away from it a little bit, but like it's still the best glue language I know of.
Yeah, Ruby's like an amazing language. It's really Yukihiro Matsumoto is a creator. He made it in the 90s, wanting to mix together different features of a bunch of languages he liked, and it kind of remained. It was this language that had a passionate, very small community for about 10 or 12 years, and then a guy named David Hannemeyer Hansen wrote a framework with it called Ruby on Rails, and that blew Ruby through the stratosphere. So it almost wasn't a language we would be talking about today if it weren't for some lucky breaks. But it's his goal, Matt's goal was to developer happiness. That's what he said his goal was. So he wanted a language that was fun to write and beautiful and close to English, and it's just very, yeah, it's a wonderful language to write in, and it's found its place in the community. You know, when it was at its peak, maybe 8 years ago, maybe people were like taking shots at it left and right. But now that it's not on top anymore, I think it's just settled into being a great, like, well-respected choice for certain types of apps. So I would say definitely consider Ruby as a choice.
Yeah.
Is it a general purpose language like Python, or was it made specifically for web development or something?
It would be very comparable to Python. I mean, that's actually part of where it's lost a little bit of mind share, is for whatever reason that AI and ML libraries, like the bindings for those languages tend to be a lot better in Python. And that became such a big thing over the last, number of years that, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's as much as anything what pulled people away from Ruby.
You say binding?
Yeah, so a lot of the libraries you will use are not actually written. Like if you're using Python, your Postgres driver, your machine learning libraries, your data crunching stuff is most likely written in C. And there's libraries that link those things together. So that was what I was calling a binding. And for certain things like machine learning, they tended to be better in like a big data type stuff, they tended to be better in Python. And that was one of the things that drew people to Python over Ruby over the years. I mean, I still prefer Ruby by far. In fact, I saw a question about, I used the expression a glue language, and I never actually explained what that means. So when they talk about a glue language, it's basically something that's designed to pull a bunch of things together. So Ruby is really good for if I need to talk to a Postgres database and I need to do some shell scripting and I need to do some API requests, and then I need to format all this into a JSON blob that I pipe into another program, and then I read it back, and then I spit it all out in a PDF or something like that. I just need to pull a whole bunch of things together. It's good for, script. It's another way would be just say it's a scripting language. Let's see, there's another question here about, we referenced the idea of its popularity, how you keep track of like industry trends and whatnot. One way is just looking at the job postings. It used to be, like Jake was saying, like 8 years ago, like 2012, 2014, like every other job listing, at least at a startup, was like, we want Ruby on Rails experience. And you don't see those so much anymore. So you look at the job listings to see what is the stuff that's most in demand. And as far as what's more, what's trending, Hacker News, Reddit, is where a lot of that stuff you tend to see stuff there first. Like Ruby and Rails were like really popular on that type place before it hit the mainstream, by several years.
Yeah, I'd also, to shade that comment a tiny bit, I would say when I first got into the field, it seemed like everything was changing all the time, super fast. And I was like, how can I possibly keep up with this? I don't know if you all feel that way now, but it doesn't change as fast as it like seems when you're first getting into it. And especially if you spend a lot of time on like online, if you spend a lot of time on like Twitter or Hacker News or Reddit, you'll quickly come to the conclusion that like whatever you're doing is the wrong thing and you need to change to a whole new framework and your language isn't any good. And that's not true. And it's kind of just like a hype. It's like a hype machine. If you're good at Ruby on Rails, there's jobs for you today. If you didn't get into React 6 years ago when everyone was like, this is the future, there's still jobs for you. There's like, it's good to keep your finger on the pulse, and it's always really good to like learn new things, but don't get caught up in that like hype cycle, because I did, and I think it's kind of, a lot of it's just people who want something to be true, or are kind of always jumping onto the next hot thing.
Yeah, agreed.
Yep, I agree. Other questions?
So today we're pretty much just working in Postgres. So I imagine we're going to have to work in Python, I'm assuming, when we want like to access our database and then pull data, manipulate it, and then push it to, I'm assuming, Django or something like that. How would we do that? Do you have like an example that you could show with Ruby, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. That's where that the part we skipped today really comes in, is the ORM. So like let's see if I have a console to demonstrate this on. Not really. But I can almost, Ruby's so simple, I can almost just describe it. You have a record called casts, right? To go back to our previous thing, and you say cast dot first. That's the active record method for the first record of a type. That's when you're typing that, you're typing Ruby, or if you're doing it in Python, you're typing Python. You're not typing SQL. But what the platform is actually doing for you in the end is running a SQL query. And an active record, it prints out the SQL query underneath it. So you say post.first, and then it literally, cast.first, and then it says right beneath it, select star from cast, order by created at limit 1. so that's an example of like, if you know the SQL, that that message is familiar to you and like, oh, cool, I get it. If you don't know the SQL, that's fine, but you're like a little bit less informed about what's going on. And that's why I think it's great to know the SQL. But the way you'll be interacting probably in your projects is through the ORM. You'll say, give me the first post, and in Python, and then the query will run. So that's the missing piece of this puzzle.
Okay, so is the ORM in your case is Ruby, or is there like a library that you have to pull in and that's the ORM? Or-
Yeah, there are libraries that come with your framework typically. So in Ruby on Rails, the ORM is called Active Record. In Python, the ORM is called Django ORM, I believe, or a very popular one. So it comes with Django. I can't remember any other ones really, but those are the two that I've used the most. And you can choose different ORMs. People write ORMs. You can use a language like Rust, which didn't have an ORM, and then they introduced one called Diesel like 5 years ago. So it's like, it's just a way of writing SQL in a language that you like.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
there's several layers of libraries. So in most languages, like the very bottom layer is the Postgres project itself provides a C library that you can write stuff, in a low-level language like C and talk to the Postgres database. Above that layer in Python and in Ruby, there's wrappers or bindings that use that underlying C library. Like I just posted a link in the Zoom chat to a file that's in the SQL Workshop. And that file there it's a Ruby file. So I used to show that more when people were doing Ruby, but now that you all are in Python, I kind of skip over that part of it. But you can see there that it requires the PG library and then connects to a database, and it runs some SQL and it does something with the result. That's still pretty low level. Then at a level above that is that ORM, that object relational mapper. So that takes care of, you write some Ruby code or some Python code, and it translates it into SQL code. It sends that SQL code to the database, it gets the results back, and then it also translates those results back into Ruby or Python or whatever your language is objects. So there's several layers along the way, and you can use whichever layer, seems appropriate at the time.
What would you say? So, being in a boot camp, we get kind of like a shallow introduction to a lot of really important things. But we don't really get to like dive super deep, even though there's obviously a ton to learn in all of the different things. What would you say would probably be, given that maybe we'll spend one more day on SQL, right? Aside from what you guys have taught us here today. So given that, what would you say would be possibly like the biggest, I don't know if wall is the right term, but like, okay, we show up to the job, they say, okay, you need to go use SQL for this or whatever. And we're just kind of like, oh, snap. So we never covered that. I don't, what would be like the biggest thing to kind of go and learn next if we had to? Or
I've always believed that, when it comes to learning new things, kind of like follow your curiosity is always my advice. Because if you're interested in something, you're gonna stick with it and really dig deeply into it and understand it in a way that you won't if you're just like, well, now I have to check this box, right? And I think coming out of where you come from at the end of the boot camp, I think hiring managers really understand what you said at the beginning, like that you've gotten this like crash course in programming. You know a little bit about a lot of things, and that's what I would expect to see. And so I wouldn't expect anything other than that. And I think that the thing that really drives like learning for me and for a lot of people, I think, is like having to solve a problem. When I want to learn something new, I'll usually like try to read through the docs. I'll try to read through the docs like once. You can read the documentation for most open source libraries in like an afternoon if you just sit down. Just read through them so you can see like, well, this is the rough things that this thing claims to do. You don't have to memorize it all or like understand it completely, but it comes in useful later when you have it like a seed is planted in your mind, like, oh, this is some of the things that this can do. But then what really drives learning is like having to solve problems. Like if you get to that job and they're saying, I want you to do this and this and this, that's going to push you to learn it a lot faster than anything else, I think. And that's how I've learned most of the things that I know.
Yeah, I would concur and summarize as just what you choose what to learn based on what interests you and what you need to, need an interest. If you're asking specifically about like what would be one thing more that would be really useful or would be like a biggest thing to draw from this when you're actually on a job, I would say you're not actually going to write SQL directly, most likely, not very often. You're probably going to use one of these ORMs, which I think you're going to get to even later in the week. So the thing that you gain out of this is getting the survey of what's under the hood and knowing some of how it works. And that can really matter with performance stuff. So like, for example, let's say you had a database that had 1 million customers in it, and you were supposed to say, find the 10 most profitable customers. Well, naively in Python or Ruby or whatever, you would say, well, find all the customers, load them all into my application, and then I'm going to run a loop and I'm going to do some things. If you're 6 weeks into this, you probably have some ideas for like how you could do that. If you had 1 million rows, find the biggest ones, whatever, call a sort function, who knows. But the thing is, that's going to be horribly slow because that means you essentially have to download your entire database into your application. So that idea of knowing, hey, I can have the database do a little bit of work for me so I only get the data I need instead of grabbing all of it at once. That's probably the most significant thing that application developers who use an ORM and do not know any SQL, that's probably the biggest weakness they have, is pulling in way too much information from the database.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm more on the front end these days, and so the fact that I know SQL is like, I just feel like it's like it comes in really handy, and it allows me to answer questions that like I wouldn't have any other way to answer. A lot of SQL, I think, is like just being able to answer questions. Someone says, hey, how many, are we running out of space in the database or something? It's like I can go answer that question myself. I don't have to ask somebody else or trust some like output on some dashboard somewhere. I can just run a query.
And Jake mentioned the docs, and I would recommend the Postgres docs. However, this is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing if you like reading the docs in the afternoon. They literally are like 3,000 plus pages of the Postgres docs. Yeah, they probably, I do not know of an open source or even a closed source for that matter, project that has better documentation than Postgres. Its documentation is fantastic. But because of that, and it's a big project, the docs are huge. But they actually also are written well. If you want to learn more, the first few chapters of it are kind of a tutorial and guide. And then it goes into, you know, every bit of detail from how to administer a database to how to use that C library to talk to it, to how to do backups and replication, to how to ask the database like what its current state is, like that stuff we looked at earlier, like that PG size of database thing that we did, like all of that stuff is in there, but you know, it'd take an enormous amount of time to actually read.
Yeah, when I said you could read the docs in the afternoon, I probably should have said except for Postgres.
Yeah.
But you can read React's docs, you can read Go's docs, you can read maybe not Ruby, but you can get a sense of all those documentation in an afternoon if you kind of skim, and that's all I'm really suggesting.
Right.
Do we have one final question?
Sure, I'll ask you a question. So I don't know if you'll know the answer to this or not, but for data analysts, do you know if they're working more like with Postgres or similar, or are they also using the ORM to do their jobs?
I would expect them to be using SQL a lot.
Yeah, I know somebody who was an analyst, like a marketing analyst at a pretty big company for a long time, and she was writing SQL and Python. I don't know much more about it than that. I don't know if it was in a REPL or in PG admin or something, but a fair amount of people who aren't programmers use SQL. That's a kind of cool thing about the language is it's not just it's not just limited to a specific job title. A lot of analysts and people like that are pretty good with SQL. I'd say this person is like at one time like just as good as I was at SQL for specific tasks.
Yeah, for reporting especially, you know, and we covered the basics of select today. And, you know, a business person that just wants to get information, they're not going to need to do the data modeling to design this stuff. You know, presumably a developer already set that up. They just need to write some selects and they can get the basics of that, you know, like we did here, you know, in a few hours a day and, you know, maybe a few weeks of experience, and then they're pretty much good to go.
Well, as I said, I'm in the Slack always, and will continue to be. And I'd like to just say thanks everyone for sticking with us today and paying attention for a lot of information. And this is not easy stuff, but it will get easier, and you will pick it up as time goes on. I'm confident. And thank you all for your service as well. And also thank you to everyone at Code Platoon, Rod and the whole team for bringing us back again. It's always a pleasure and a really good way to spend a day. Jack, over to you.
Yeah, you kind of took the words out of my mouth there. Thanks for having us. I hope you got something out of it. And you know, like Jake said, you can message me in the Slack and whatnot if you want to ask any further questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody know if we're doing stand down, et cetera?
No idea.